and the prince has the other one. This at last is my wife, declared the happy prince. Then his men seized the other Maria from the saddle, gave her a smack, and knocked her down in the dust. They kicked her soundly a couple of times, and that was the end of that. Get up in the saddle, my dear, said the prince to Cinderella. No, where the burrow dung was mounted, I'll not climb up, she replied. So the prince carried her and her father away on other horses for a beautiful wedding with priest and bishop and all the trimmings. There was great rejoicing at the castle that day. That's the end of the tale. It went down deep in the ground and sprouted up in a beanstalk, so Benedicto can tell us one more. Oh, hello. I didn't see you there. My name is Ian. Today we're talking about Axel Olrik's Epic Laws. What a wonderful title, The Epic Laws of Folk Narrative. Now, what are these epic laws? What was he trying to do? Basically, I believe he was trying to answer or propose a method for analyzing texts as they appeared in archives. Because, of course, prior to the very late 19th century, and really well into the 20th century, collections of materials did not benefit from recordings. And so, audio recordings, they could only be recorded by hand. And so we have these things that are present in archives, and archive in the loosest sense of the word, manuscripts dating back centuries, dating back to the beginning of sort of a manuscript tradition. And he's asking the question, well, is there a way of determining whether this text, whether a particular narrative is from a folk literary tradition or a written literary tradition? How do you determine a split between the two? Basically, what are the features of oral narrative? What are the laws that it abides by? And he's particularly interested in epic, hence his epic laws. So the epic in terms of like a national, or often a nationalized, I should say, a hero story that is made representative of the state, or often has in subsequent years been made representative of the state. So the question remains, how do you sort of parse that? Is this did someone sit down and write this thing, or is this actually a product of the folk? And he proposes basically a number of lenses that seem consistent throughout folk narrative. Because things like a mersenne and an epic are very similar on the structural level in many ways. I mean, they often involve unlikely heroes, they often involve the interaction of natural and supernatural agents, extraordinary interventions, and someone from lowly circumstances rising to defeat, often on behalf of the people, some kind of looming threat. So, a good idea for a story, a good idea for a folk story. And so he just proposes these laws, and I think that they are remarkably wonderful. And so this is a very straightforward reading, but it's always nice to illustrate them in a number of ways. And this first thing, which is an obvious one, but not as obvious as one might think, is his law of opening. That basically there is a section, an introductory prefatory sentence or two, that signals that narrative is about to take place. You don't have that in the text of a literary work, or at least it's not common. And if it is introduced, it's often it's a literary device as opposed to a necessary thing. So in tales, the classic example is once upon a time. And once you hear the words once upon a time, you know that there is something, the text that follows, the words that come out of my mouth afterwards, are going to be somewhat different, that you're going to evaluate them in a different way, you're going to evaluate them with a different set of expectations, that you are not, that one of the evaluations is not in terms of like an account of some kind of actual epistemic historical thing, but ontological, not epistemic, but a narrative. You know that we are entering the story world. So you have Once Upon a Time, using the Newfoundland tradition, the stories that Halpert and Widdowson collected. It was a wonderful opening. Once upon a time, and a very good time it was, not in your time, deed in my time, in olden times, when quart bottles hold half a gallon, and houses were papered with pancakes, and pigs run about, forks stuck in their ass, see who wanted to buy pork. How could you not love that? You know, once you hear that, you're like, God damn, I'm about to hear a story. And so you're shifted in that way. And that framing device becomes incredibly important. People like Catherine Young and her idea of tale worlds. It's contingent upon that. You can make arguments that because the book is a tangible artifact, things like the opening up is equivalent, literally the opening up of a book, or a film, it has things like the procession of going to the theater, and so that there are actions that enter you into the tale world, and then those sorts of expectations. But they're not necessarily part of the movie itself, opening credits or whatever, which sort of signals. But we still have that. We have these things that signal that a story is about to begin, and the epic laws suggest a fairly limited number of formulas. Those formulas are not limited by virtue of the folklorists, they're limited by the particular culture, that the culture has frames for how to enter into a story. Similarly, and its immediate parallel is the law of closing. Stories come to an end. We signal the end. The end doesn't end because the plots are done. The end is ended because the narrator wraps up the act of narration and often brings people back to the moment. So again, that's the end of the tale. It went down deep in the ground and sprouted up in a beanstalk, so Benedicto can tell us one more. And so it's just a ritual ending. The Newfoundland example, and They All Lived Happily Ever After is sort of the classic Anglo-European version, and the Newfoundland version, and they lived happily ever after, and they were married and having babies in basketfuls when I come away. All they give me was the slipper and a glass. I comes all the way, sliding on me ass. Gotta love it. Another aspect that's common in folk folk narrative, and when you see it, it seems to be indicative of something, is the law of repetition. A law of repetition basically means that in order to explain emphasis or the importance of something, something happens a number of times. So, the Cinderella goes to the ball in the Aschenputtel, in the Perrault version, not in the Disney version, because one of the reasons it doesn't happen in the Disney version is because you don't need emphasis when you have the benefit of an audiovisual cue. It would be redundant if you did it 3 times. But in the Grimm's version and Perrault version and in most versions, Cinderella goes to the ball, or whatever the ball is named as an event, 3 times. 3 nights in a row, dances with the prince. It's on the 3rd night where he sets the trap of, he actually tries to stop her, and the only thing he can stop is the shoe. So tests will often happen 3 times. And of course, one of the things that follows up in a subsequent law is that a test will be underlined by the fact that other characters will try that test. They will fail, and they will succeed. But there's a remarkable amount of repetition. On the level of words, the same sentences are used over and over again. Little pig, let me in, not by the hair of my chin, chin, chin. In prose, in literature, or written literature, repetition is a peculiarity. But it's remarkably commonplace in oral tests. So every time A striking scene occurs in a narrative and continuity permits, the scene is repeated. This is necessary not only to build tension, but to fill out the body of the narrative. There is intensifying repetition and simple repetition, but the important point is that without repetition, the saga cannot attain its fullest form. And that's the translation that they use for basically tale. It cannot expand if you don't have this level of repetition. How often is it repeated? Well, it shifts easily into the next epic law, which is the law of three. Just a quick corrective to Olrik. The law of three, that there are significant social numbers of how much something is repeated, is an important observation. Or that things are clustered into groups of a certain number. Three little pigs, three billy goats gruff, the two stepsisters and Cinderella, etc., etc., etc. Three is not a universal. There are other cultures where the number is 4. There are other cultures where the number is 7. But there is typically a culturally assumed number that emphasizes repetition and then signals completeness. That if you were to go on to a 4th, you're like, wait, no. So, but law of three seems to be very present. So nothing distinguishes the great bulk of folk narrative from modern literature and from reality as much as does the number 3. Such a ruthlessly rigid structuring of life stands apart from all else. When a folklorist comes upon a 3, he thinks, as does the Swiss who catches sight of his Alps again, now I am home. And again, it's not a universal, but certainly for Northern European and the European diaspora, it's fairly prominent. And so I dig his point. Even if we have to qualify it, I dig his point. We just had a law of 3. What about a law of 2? His next one is that there's only ever 2. I'm going to say 2 dramatis personae, but there's 2 to a scene. Basically, at any given moment, only 2 characters can be interacting at any moment. So you have Little Red Riding Hood and the grandmother. You have Little Red Riding Hood and the wolf. You have the wolf and the grandmother. You have the Little Red Riding Hood and the wolf. You have Little Red Riding Hood and the woodsman. You have the woodsman and the wolf. It's 2 to a scene at any moment. And 3, okay, so his explanation is 3 people appearing at the same time, each with his own individual identity and role to play, would be a violation of tradition. The princesses of folktales can attend the battle with the dragon only as mute onlookers. So they might be implied there, but they are, all things happen in these 2s. And he doesn't provide an explanation. I have always thought that one of the things that's important is, and this is, to me, this is why the epic laws are so fascinating. Because to me, what's important about that insight in particular is that if I were telling, and when I tell stories, I will often recount events in a way that turns them into laws of 2. Why? Because I'm characterizing. I am essentially acting. And so when I said, I talked to my mom, and my mom said, don't do this. And I said, don't do this. And she said, yeah, don't do this. And there we go. So I went to my dad, and I said, what? And he said, don't do this. And I said, don't do this. And he said, don't do this. Because storytelling, the literal act of, in the sort of the pure verbal art performance, with all the gestures and all the cues and all the signals, it would still, there are a remarkable number of resources of one person sitting there and gesticulating and using tone and everything that they can with the human voice would still be difficult logically to perform a number of characters interacting at the exact same moment. So that seems to be one of the, to me, that's the insight. And the thing that goes unexpressed in this is, his argument is, how do we distinguish between orality and oral literature and written literature? And I think he's getting at the fact that because things are spoken, there are certain limitations. And again, An art form that has limitations does not mean an art form that is inherently overly simple, or an art form that is not that is not evolved or something like that. It just this is the nature of the thing, and so we then see the stories that are shaped within this particular context. Written text, print, allows a different kind of narrative to take place. All power to you. There you go. You have the law of contrast in that because narrators don't extemporize. They don't typically qualify that much. Much of this is done in dialogue. The narrator will supply sort of connective tissue, but they don't really supply a huge amount of description most of the time. So qualities tend to be emphasized, and I mean that sort of flips in a number of ways. But the law of contrast suggests that qualities are emphasized by its rapid contrast to someone else. So Cinderella is incredibly good, and her incredible goodness is made even more clear by her stepsister's wickedness. It's what do they call chiaroscuro? It's this sort of level of contrast that you need that shadow in order to see the whiteness. So it's a sort of very the metaphor of chiaroscuro works very well. That sort of that hyper contrast that takes place. Someone is the incredibly youthful are always in contrast to the very old. So things are not only are things emphasized, their emphasis takes place because people are into broad categories. The most beautiful in the world will always be next to sort of the terrifying. So the princess and the dragon are radically in contrast with each other. Old and youth, male and female. I mean, that's why one of the reasons we sort of they sort of fall into these intense binaries is that you have these sort of absolutely idealized within the particular cultural context, which could be, of course, terrible, but models of masculine behavior and models of feminine behavior, because you want to sort of emphasize that difference. So his words, the saga is always polarized. A strong Thor requires a wise Odin or a cunning Loki next to him. A rich Peter Kramer, a poor Paul Schmid. Near a grieving woman sits a joyful or comforting one. This very basic opposition is a major rule of epic composition. Young and old, large and small, man and monster, good and evil. So contrast works in order to emphasize, which means that there isn't a huge amount of nuance in the characterization of characters. There you go, in folk narrative. Then there's the law of twins, which is different from the law of two to a scene. I cannot emphasize that enough. But it means that there are often indistinguishable characters that serve the exact same function. Really, they are there in part to emphasize sometimes they sort of are in conjunction with the law of repetition, in that you need the same thing to happen a second time. So, or they're there to help pack out the law of three, and pack out the law of contrast. So if you think, but fundamentally they are indistinguishable from each other. What distinguishes the two stepsisters in Cinderella? I know I keep going back to Cinderella, but it works very well. Nothing. They're exactly the same. They serve the same function. Now, when brought into a visual depiction, you depict them differently. So you'll have I believe in Disney, one's a blonde and one's a brunette. They both have the upturned noses. They are virtually indistinguishable from each other, save that one is blonde and one is brunette. In the Seven Dwarfs, in Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, the dwarfs are seven. I mean, again, it's not a law of three. It's just a cluster of people, and that's something about the law of three. Sometimes it's just a whole bunch of people that are indistinguishable from each other. It's typically three. But with the dwarves are no different from one each other. It's only when it gets into the Disney version that we start distinguishing the dwarves. giving them names and giving them characteristics, because it would be weird if 7 more or less functionally identical people. But Rosencrantz and Guildenstern in Hamlet, they function very much to the point of being virtually indistinguishable from each other. And to the point where Tom Stoppard writes Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are dead, and the whole identity aspect, and that fundamentally Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are folk characters in as much as they are twins. The only thing that distinguishes them is that they have different names, really. And so Tom Stoppard's play is about the identity crisis of not having one's own identity and not even being able to keep track necessarily of who is who. Yeah, so the twins, they serve no other function apart from, well, no, they will serve a function. They will serve a function because they will often be the contrast. They will serve a function because they might provide a donor role. They might be false heroes. They might be villains. They might be, instead of like one nasty person, it's 7 nasty persons, but they're all fundamentally in the same thing. So there is nothing that really distinguishes them from each other. And that's the point, because remember, the issue is trying to contrast this with written literature. So literature demands character. Literature demands characterization. So they will name the sisters, they will name the dwarves, they will name, they will just provide some kind of information. And not simply literature, depictions, film. Because they're going to be performed by 2 different actors, and the actors are basically going to be, for lack of a better word, the characters are often indistinguishable from each other. I and a colleague co-wrote an article about using the epic laws to explain things like Adam Sandler movies. And if you want to think about how in, Billy Madison, the characters played by Norm Macdonald and, Artie Lang? Was it Artie Lang? Maybe it was Artie Lang. Anyway, the characters played by those 2, Billy's childhood friends, they're twins. They are functionally identical to each other. They don't do anything that is different, except that one is played by Norm Macdonald and one is played by, I believe, Artie Lang. So we still see it. I mean, if you just think about, and because, Adam Sandler, romantic comedies are Märchen. Adam Sandler movies, the early Adam Sandler movies are Märchen. And so we see it all the time. These characters that they don't have backstories particularly. I seem to be dissing these, and I'm not. But they are there to serve some kind of contrast. They are there to service the protagonist in some particular way. And really, the only distinction between them is that they are played by different actors, and therefore we distinguish them. But otherwise, they're basically the same. So yeah. I forgot that Adam Sandler paper. I should bring that up again sometime. Anyway, the importance of initial and final position is often tied into these things. So basically, the name of the law basically suggests it all. It's important when the first thing happens, and it's important when the last thing happens. So, and it seems to sort of be in a number of different things. So, for example, the Cinderella drops her slipper on the 3rd night. It is the 3rd little pig who builds with bricks. In other stories, the first person, like the 12 Dancing Princesses, for example, the first princess does it, and then all the remaining, do the math, 11 princesses do the same thing. His definition, whenever a series of persons or things occurs, then the principal one will come first. Coming last, though, will be the person for whom the particular narrative arouses sympathy. So primacy is important, but the ultimate character is typically important. So, I mean, in the 12 Dancing Princesses, when they are all basically the protagonist, they will all do things more or less shot at the same time. In the 3 Little Pigs, the 3rd pig is the one who proves to be the hero, so it's the last. But you'll just see the sort of remarkable coincidence of firstness and lastness. This is in contrast to written literature. So, and the point he makes clear, and this is where he starts tying his rules together, we can start tying them together a little bit earlier if we want, is the idea that this law of initial and final position will sometimes throw itself in when we start talking about the law of twins. So you do have that the law of three, I mean, this is where I've already talked about this, but this is in the reading where he starts to make this explicit. The law of three sometimes is a law of twins and plus the law of importance of final position. So 2 or less indistinguishable sisters, then Cinderella, 2 or less indistinguishable pigs, and then the brick pig, and so on. So we can see how he's, as I said, this is where he starts combining the rules or suggesting that the rules exist not siloed, but in combinations with each other. But we've already made that point because we're so clever. Another law is that attributes are primarily expressed in actions. Again, the narrator doesn't do much in terms of characterization. We come across that more in literature. And there's sort of a cliche of screenwriting where you have, show, don't tell, where if you want to explain someone's situation, you show them, you demonstrate to the audience how they are. You don't have other characters say so, and you don't have voiceover narration. You try not to, at the very least. So if you want to think that that's actually one of the ways that film is closer to oral narrative than it is to literature, because literature will sort of go into the inner mind of the character, and the narrator will tell you. But it's through actions that attributes are typically expressed. So someone isn't simply described as clever. They demonstrate their cleverness, or they demonstrate their thrift, or they demonstrate their piety. They are not merely beautiful. People react to their beauty. Again, you can actually think, on one hand, I'll diss Disney versions, but like in the opening song for Beauty and the Beast, we are not told that she is beautiful. We are, all the other characters in the village talk about how beautiful she is. And so it doesn't need to be a narrator saying, "Oh, Belle is the most beautiful person in the world." People react to her beauty. So, which is a better way of doing it. His words, "I shall present only a single example here. If one were to begin, there was once a young motherless girl who was unhappy but beautiful and kind. It would be entirely too complicated a thought for immersion. It is much better when these actions are expressed in action and when these actions are all connected." And I think the idea of the complication of thought, I don't know whether we should think he is being disparaging of folk narration. That when too complicated is as if they couldn't have understood that. Rather, I think it is just not part of the form. That the narrator is, the storyteller is a lot less of a narrator than we might typically suggest. The narration is more or less to describe the actions that can't be depicted in words. There isn't and context and setting. And isn't much in terms of the characterization. Whereas in books, in written literature, you could just have a different kind of thing. Another critical point of folk literature, in one of his epic laws, is the law of a single strand, that it's one narrative that is followed through. There is a linear progression. If you need some kind of backstory, that's told in dialogue. It isn't told as, the narrator doesn't break and starts talking about things. More to the point, a storyline is not dropped momentarily to go to a completely different story. That doesn't mean that tales can't be compound. And as we read elsewhere, for example, when Vladimir Propp in Morphology of the Folktale talks about compound tales, a tale can reach some kind of point that isn't its conclusion, and then can move on, almost move backwards and have like a different complication. But it isn't a series of parallel plots. It's still single strand. For prop, the hero might transfer to, the dramatis personae of the hero might transfer to a different character and move on. But it's still not parallelism. It's not, okay, now these characters are doing this thing over here. I'm going to have to stop for a minute and have this completely different story. And this is going to tie in also with concentration on a leading character. That is kind of critical. Now, you can do things like, Little Red Riding Hood is on the path. Meanwhile, the wolf goes forward and goes to the grandmother's house. So, that is a legitimate, as it were, strand. But I mean, that's all part of the single integrity of the narrative. That is not a separate plot. Once you start having separate plots, you start entering into literature. A good example, and someone who is writing in the epic style, and someone who is very aware of the conventions of epic literature would be Tolkien, and J.R.R. Tolkien, and The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. And The Hobbit is a clear single-strand narrative, and you can sort of see that. And you could also see things like, you can make arguments that Law of Twins, and that, half of those dwarves have no distinct personality from each other, and they just have different names and so on. When even in the book they're virtually indistinguishable. In the movies, they start having different levels of characterization. I think in the movie, like the 3 movies of The Hobbit, just to spread it out, they decided to give each one a deep backstory. I haven't seen them. Merry and Pippin in Lord of the Rings are virtually indistinguishable from each other. They might have the occasional different characteristic. But in Lord of the Rings, when at the end of Fellowship of the Ring, then for all of Two Towers and all of Return of the King, you have 3 different stories. It's like, here's what's happening with Merry and Pippin, here's what's happening with Aragorn and Orlando Bloom, and then here's what's happening with Sam and Frodo, and back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. You couldn't do that in oral narrative. You would need to sort of have it, you need to basically pick one, just because of sort of the level of complexity. So that's a good example of something that intimates at epic, but is clearly a piece of literature, because you have the benefit of that sort of you have the benefit of text. You have the benefit, and text allows for different things, and written text allows for more complicated stories because it is easier to keep track of. So think of text as being a series of helps, and not necessarily a more advanced art form. It's just like, it's got more platforms on it. It's like, cooking with one pot versus cooking with, a 10-burner stove. It's like, it doesn't necessarily make you better cooking. It just, you got a lot more resources. You can make a more complicated meal with a 10-burner stove than you can with one pot. Doesn't make you a better cook. There you go. That's a good analogy. Take that home to your mom. Yes, keep on going. God, I love this. Patterning. Patterning is one of the most important features, and that's on the level of language, not necessarily on the level of event, as has been going on, but on the level of language, you will have the same words appear. You will have formulaic constructions, not simply the formula of or the structure and the generic nature of tale, but you will have formulaic language. You have these linguistic conventions. So you will, it'll be sort of virtual repetition. And again, just think of it in terms of contrast, in that if you were to read the same sentence, more or less identical, in a piece of literature, it would strike you as odd. But if you read it, if you hear the same thing in tale-telling, It ties into that law of repetition, one of his very early ones. It ties into a sense of the building of intensity that is both important in tale telling, but also using the fewer resources that verbal art has at its dispense. So again, you'll have the repetition of entire scenes. And the other thing is that this also removes anything that's extraneous. That repetition is also part of the, what does he say, the rigid stylizing of life has its own peculiar aesthetic value. Everything superfluous is expressed. So by having a limited vocabulary, as it were, by sticking to formulas, by sticking to formulaic constructions, you are contributing to the essentializing of the narrative to help make things more intense, to help make things more focused on the particular singular narrative. And his next point, his next law, is the idea that there are tableau scenes. And tableau scenes, I think, are kind of really interesting exercise in that so much of the action is that there are, okay, I'm just going to use his words, crystallized moments of narrative that heighten the narrative elements into a few representative scenes. And I think one of the ways of sort of explaining this, so you will have, if you were to illustrate a Märchen, illustrate a traditional tale, in a comic book or something, or in some other form, children's storybook, what scenes would you need to include in order to give the most sort of striking representation? And again, I'm going to go back to Little Red Riding Hood. You probably have her leaving the grandmother's house, and where all the backstory is more or less implied, and you see her in her riding hood, you see her with a full basket, you just see, like, maybe you see mother waving or not, but you have her sort of venturing from the house and maybe moving towards the woods. And all of a sudden you have an entire prefatory section explained, crystallized in one movement. You have her meeting the wolf, the lupine, tall, law of contrast wolf with the little innocent girl, the darkness of the woods, the ambiguity of the path, and so on. A heightened tension where everything is sort of condensed. The essential elements of the narrative are included in that. You would have the third one probably with the grandmother, with the wolf and the grandmother in their kind, again, the large, the masculine, now the young, and the old, tiny, frail, in heightened contrast. And this, the civilized and the animalistic, clearly. Not animal, but animalistic. And then you would have the bed scene, wolf dressed as grandmother in Little Red Riding Hood, again in that different contrast, but also with the emphasis on age and so on. And then finally you would have like the woodsman. You could condense the entire thing into 5 or 6 salient points. And that's kind of what a tableau scene is. When the images just sort of crystallize into one particular moment. You could think of it in terms of movie trailers. You could think of it in terms of a whole bunch of different examples where everything can be more or less, and movie posters for that matter, everything can be condensed down to this one particular scene. So I think, and this is me, this isn't Olrik, but I think that one of the things that might be a key factor in tableau scenes is that they can kind of act as a mnemonic device. Because if you think of a narrative, if you think of the actual reconstruction of a narrative, you might begin as a storyteller basically, all right, this narrative can be mentally broken down into like these 6 scenes or these 6 tableau scenes. And then how do I get from point A to point B, and then from point B to point C, and from point C to point D. And so if you were to think of a narrative as just like this series of images, and again, not illustrations. We're not necessarily talking about like the 19th century illustrations, although those are going to be incredibly important in terms of they are creating tableau scenes out of the text. But more to the point, more to the point, if that was your mental image, how do you go from point A to point B? All of a sudden you have a tool for how to reconstruct that narrative. Okay, well, what comes next? Well, it's not what comes next, it's what do I need to get to? And then, boom, in the woods. Boom, grandma's house, and so on. So you want to think in terms of memory. You want to think in terms of what is in the construction. And Holbeck isn't saying this. Sorry, Olrik isn't saying this. But it is, I think at the very least, it is hovering in the background. How do you move from point A to point B? Because of that sort of idea, he also talks about that there is a logic, that the universe needs to be consistent in which this tale is operating. And so it doesn't matter if it's not consistent with ours. Everyone, because you've said the opening formula, we recognize that it's not going to operate in the way that our world operates. But if you have suggested something, it needs to be consistent. So if a premise is established, it needs to be, it can't be discounted later. Plausibility is always based upon the force of the internal validity of the plot. Plausibility is very rarely measured in terms of external reality. And as such, the supernatural is, it can be met with awe, but it won't be met with confusion because it's a world in which these things happen. So the logic is and you can see that doubly so in other forms, that I do not want to confuse things and suggest that they are immediately parallel, but at the very least have some consistency to each other. Things like science fiction. I mean, science fiction establishes the premises and the laws of that universe. They'll ascribe a scientific rationale or a pseudo-scientific rationale to it, and then they need to be consistent. So there needs to sort of be a coherence to them. That ties in as well to this unity of plot, and that everything is moving forwards to its natural conclusion, and there is nothing that is superfluous to the epic narrative. Again, you don't have these additional strands. You don't have what you might call side quests, as it were. The side quest is perhaps you can make an argument that almost the equivalent of a side quest would be something like an extended testing sequence where you get something, but that something needs to be integral to the completion of the task. It can't be a sort of superfluous thing. There is nothing in the narrative that is ultimately extraneous. And there's an almost brutal logic and a brutal unity, to the point where, at the very least, there's an expectation this had better pay off. There's a kind of Chekhov's gun aspect about the folk narrative, and that everything that gets introduced needs to have a point. So Chekhov's, maybe you don't. Chekhov's gun is that law that if you introduce a gun in Act 1, by Act 3, it has been used. So if you introduce something, my favorite version of this is, you see it in action movies all the time. So you have things like Beverly Hills Cop, where you introduce the idea that early in the movie that smugglers often pack drugs in coffee grounds in order to throw off the scent of dogs. And that little bit of interesting information then reappears like 40 minutes later, when coffee grounds are enough probable cause for Axel Foley to say, oh, okay, well, this is it. Same thing happens in 2, in that he figures out one way of, or he sort of shows one way of short-circuiting a security device. He uses gum and the foil from a piece of gum, and is able to therefore close the circuit and allow him to break open a window, which he can then use without reference later on in the movie. I haven't seen Beverly Hills Cop 2 since the theaters. Wow, I should see it again. But anyway, that kind of thing. You see in action movies all the time. Something that you didn't know happens, reappears as a factoid later on. I see it on, what's our great example of Mershin? Law and Order. Law and Order and Law and Order Special Victims Unit. You see those little nuggets all the time. In the first 5 minutes, something is introduced, and then later on, that proves sort of the final piece of evidence that's required. So you have this unity, and you can see that on the level of a Mershin, which is not a single episode. I mean, there is one overarching arc, but you also have that in Epic, where Epic is often a series of narratives, but all the narratives are coherent to each other, and there is no individual narrative is not contributing to that larger point of demonstrating either the heroism of the person or the family or the nation. It is cumulative. They don't go for a particular sort of flying away. And I think there is only one more epic law, and that's the concentration on the leading character. And I think that is sort of established at this point, more or less, that the protagonist appears most often. It is that protagonist's story. There might be preparatory sections. There might be moments of background. There might be the occasional interactions. Again, things like there are scenes in Little Red Riding Hood where it is just the wolf and the grandmother, or subsequently maybe it's just the wolf and the woodsman. For the most part, it's on her the entire time. Cinderella, it's on her the entire time. So that is that's both obvious, but also one. I mean, I keep on saying why am I making this point? Because he is making this point. Because Olrik is establishing once again that when we are looking for evidence, when we are trying to go back and discover whether this thing is written, whether it is a piece that was always intended to be written in the text, written as text and understood as text, even if it is trying to emulate folk narrative. The leading character is a clear indication. These rules are not absolute. It is one of those things like, sort of definitions of art, that all of them don't have to be present. But enough of them are going to be present that you will see this. So there's always going to be some kind of variation, but not much. You'll be surprised how much this works. And ultimately, again, we want to think in terms of anticipation, because as we're trying to figure out how these things function, we are again always projecting ourselves into the next version, or the next storytelling event. And so as we're learning these epic laws, or as we try and sort of unpack these epic laws, just as we try and unpack any kind of deeper structure of how oral literature works, it's always a matter of, therefore, what does the audience know when they are bringing, and what are they bringing to the moment of performance, as much as we are trying to discern what the teller is doing at the moment of performance. Yeah. So I love Ulrik's epic laws of folk narrative. I think it is important. I think it is fun. I think it is remarkably useful. As I said, it's remarkable how much you can see it as still operative in a number of genres, a lot in vernacular film, a lot in genre fiction. It is still very much present, and it's good to see. Anyway, I will bid you well, as I always do, my friends. Bye-bye.